Today I thought I'd demo how to make some pad sounds using Ableton's Wavetable synth. Wavetable is one of the synth instruments that comes included with Ableton Suite, and it is often compared to other Wavetable synth plugins like Serum, Pigments, or Vital, and is sometimes perceived as lacking in features compared to those. Wavetable is not lacking in features in terms of sound design possibilities. That's especially considering that in Ableton as a whole you can add as many modulators and effects as you need, and you can put Wavetable in a rack with a sampler or any other instrument and essentially get any sound you could ever possibly want that way. Where it is lacking is that the presets that come with Ableton are pretty limited, and most of them aren't that good. And the preset navigation and indexing sucks ass compared to what you get in something like Analog Lab or anything else really, I guess. Now, none of that shit matters if you're designing your own sounds, and Wavetable has a few features in a workflow that I find very conducive to making ambient pads. First, it has unique Unison modes that I think sound great. It also has two independent filters that have a multitude of routing options that I think are really interesting. It has some unique oscillator effects that allow you to shape the sound really quickly and easily. And it has a good interface, and especially many of the features that are useful for pads are very easily accessible on just one screen. And it has a deep mod matrix that's very easy to use once you get used to it. So let's jump in and make a few pad sounds. So I'm going to start by making a basic pad sound that could be used as a template or starting point for any other kind of pad sound. And I've got a fresh copy of Wavetable here with the view expanded so that you can see all the modulation envelopes and both the LFOs just all on one screen. And you get to that just by hitting this this little triangle button that's on the top of the instrument here. So the basic Wavetable sound is just a sine wave with the filter wide open and no modulation, so it sounds kind of boring. So a lot of classic analog pad sounds will use a sawtooth wave as a basis for the sound, so that's what I'll do here just for this demo. The basic ingredients to make something that sounds more like what you'd expect from a pad sound are to make the envelopes slower and bring the filter back. So I'm going to set the envelope attack, decay, release times to somewhere around 1.5 to 2 seconds or so. The exact times that you'll want to use for it are going to depend on the specifics of the music you're trying to make, but this is a pretty good starting point for demonstration purposes. And I'm going to use both the amplitude envelope and envelope 2 here, and I'll show you why that is in just a second. The next thing is we'll bring the filter back to something like around 500 hertz, and I'll raise the resonance just a little bit. I find 12 dB per octave of filters for pad sounds is usually what you want. You want a bit more of a gentle roll off on your filter to let the higher harmonics of your sound come through just a little bit. Wavetable lets you pick, either 12 or 24 if you want. I'm also going to pick just one of the other analog filter emulation modes here and add just a tiny bit of drive for some reason, because I like to pretend it makes a difference. Honestly, I don't have much resonance set. I have very little drive set, so I don't think any of the filter modes make that much of a difference in this particular case. So, I mean, you can just do whatever you want. So let's just check where that gets us now. So you can see the envelopes coming into play a little bit, but we need a little bit more modulation because for a pad you typically are sustaining the same notes for a long period of time. So you want at least a little bit of modulation to make the sound a lot less boring. So the two main things that are common to most pad sounds are to use an envelope to modulate the filter cutoff. And that's why I set the ADSR times for envelope number 2, because I'm going to use envelope 2 to modulate the cutoff frequency for the filter here. So to set that modulation, if you just click on the cutoff frequency for filter 1 here, it'll make that show up as a modulation destination parameter in the mod matrix here. And then you can use envelope 2 to modulate the filter 1 cutoff frequency like that. So I'll set it to a relatively low number like 12 because I don't want the filter to open up like all the way or anything. So that'll be a good starting point to test. The next thing is to use LFOs to modulate the pitch and the filter cutoff frequency, just a very slight amount. And I'm going to do it at a fairly low rate. So I'm going to take LFO and LFO1 and LFO2 and lower the rates down to somewhere closer to like 0.3 to somewhere between like 0.25 and 0.5 hertz or so. I'm also going to lower the amount because I want a pretty subtle modulation for a pad sound. And if you just have like 100% modulation from your LFOs, it's usually just a little bit too much. So I'm going to bring these down to somewhere closer to 25 to 30%. And just for fun, for LFO number 1, I think what I'll do is I'll add some LFO attack using this parameter here. And basically what that adds is a time associated with your, basically it adds an envelope to your LFO and a time to where the modulation depth opens up all the way. So I think for a pad sound, basically what will happen is it'll start off as a very, very subtle modulation and start to grow over time, which I think makes the sound a lot more interesting for something that's sustained for a long amount of time. So I will use LFO1 to modulate the pitch and LFO2 to modulate the filter. Let's start with LFO2. And the way I like to determine how much modulation depth to set for these is to just listen to the sound. And listen to where it like starts to sound really obtrusive and obnoxious and you like really notice it. So like there, and then like dial it back to like half of that. Even that's probably a little bit too much. So like, I don't know, something like that. That's a lot better because you want something that's somewhat subtle and not too noticeable that takes the listener away, like distracts the listener and takes them away from your music because you decide to modulate your filter by a shit ton. And then for LFO1, we'll use that to modulate the pitch, and you usually want this to be pretty subtle. So like that's just way too much to me, at least. So I might even like set that at the bare minimum. So like that's, to me, sounds like a pretty good starting point. So the next thing is, and this is where the magic really starts to happen and what makes Wavetable special for making pad sounds, in my opinion, is I'm going to add some Unison. And one of the unique things about Wavetable is it has a whole bunch of different Unison modes that all sound, they all have their unique character and all behave a little bit different way. But for ambient, I think the shimmer mode for the Unison is just awesome. So I'm going to add the Unison with 5 voices and just like something like between 10 and 20%, because if you add too much, it sounds pretty obnoxious. So you get something like this. So I think this sound is fine as it is for a lot of things, and a lot of the characteristics that I set up to get to this are common to any pad sounds, or at least the types of pad sounds that I like to make. So I suggest taking something like this and just saving it as a preset so that you can use this as a starting point for other sound design options, and you don't have to reset up like the filter and all the modulation stuff again and again every time you want to design a pad sound. So let's just reflect a moment on what got us here. So right now the sound is just one saw oscillator, one filter, pretty simple modulation of just a pitch and a filter. And I haven't put any effects on the sound at all. So we're only scratching the surface of what we can be doing if we want. And so I'm going to just take the opportunity to shape the sound a little bit more. And the first thing I want to do is to remove some of the low end because it has a little bit too much of that, at least for my taste. And there's a couple ways to do that. And the first way is to just use, to turn on filter 2 and just use it as a high pass filter. And by default, like the two filters are just in series and it'll just work. Filter 2 will be engaged right after filter 1. And I think this is a pretty straightforward approach, and in most analog synthesizers, this is probably what you would be doing. But I'm just going to do something a little bit different just because in Wavetable I can. It gives you the option. So there's a couple of different filter routing modes that you can engage, and I'm going to put them in parallel using this option here. So basically what that does is it splits the oscillator signal separately into each filter. And so I'm going to turn filter 2 into a bandpass and turn up the resonance a bit and bring it up to about 250 hertz or so. So which takes away a little bit of the low end in the sound. I find that with filter 2 at about 250 hertz or so, kind of has like an orchestral string sound flavor to it, and if you raise the frequency of it a bit higher than that, it starts to transition to something with more of like a brassy kind of sound. So it's like an extra knob that you have at your disposal to shape the sound however you want. So I also want to modulate the cutoff of filter number 2. And just for fun, I want to show you that you can use envelope 3 as another LFO by turning it or changing it to run in the loop mode by using this option up here. And so basically the third envelope will loop over and over again, just like one of your LFOs. And you can't make it exactly into a sine wave like the other two can, but you can shape it pretty extensively by changing the ADSR times and by changing the shape of the attack and decay waves using this option here. So I'll shape it to something kind of that looks kind of like a triangle wave and make the rate somewhat faster than the other LFOs. And I will use that to modulate the cutoff of filter number 2, just like that. And let's take a look at that. Yeah, so that's an interesting way to make your sound a little bit less static, and just shows you another option that you can use to unlock more modulation sources to your desire. So I do want to point out that if you use envelope as an LFO using the loop mode like this, that it's unipolar as opposed to bipolar like the LFOs are. But for the purposes of modulating the cutoff frequency like I was doing, that's perfectly fine. It's not a problem at all. So the next thing I like to do to make the sound a bit wider, a trick I like to do is to use the second oscillator. So I'll turn on the second oscillator here and also set it to a sawtooth wave. And then what I like to do is just make oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 just slightly different from each other. So a common way to do this is to detune them. So if I detune oscillator 1 3 cents up and oscillator 2 3 cents down, and then I also want to shape the wave form of oscillator 2 to be just a little bit different. And there's a lot of ways to do this using the oscillator shaping effects that are included in Wavetable, but I'll just adjust the pulse width a little bit and then adjust the Wavetable up a little bit, again, just to make it the sound a little of Oscillator 2 just a little bit different. And then I'll take Oscillator 1 and I'll pan it left, let's say 34 left, and I'll take Oscillator 2 and pan it right by an equivalent amount. And by doing that, we'll add a lot of stereo width to the sound, which is great for ambient. So we got something like that now, which sounds really good to me. The next thing is, like, if you feel like your sound needs a little bit more low end, you can add a little bit of a sub oscillator, which is just right there on the left side of the interface. So just click that button. And for this, I kind of want like the bare minimum amount of sub. I think just 1 octave down. Maybe slightly more than that. That's pretty good. So I think overall for the sound as it is so far, I think filter 1, the envelope times, and the unison mode are responsible for like 90% of what the sound is, but the other things are pretty subtle overall individually, but add up a lot to make the sound a lot more interesting, in my opinion. And Wavetable makes all those features and modulation options pretty easily accessible, which is another big reason why I like this instrument for plugin sounds. But so far, there were still no effects at all on the sound so far. So just for fun, I want to add just some grain delay and some basic Ableton reverb and just show you what that sounds like. So from here, using this basic preset, we can look at different waveforms and wavetables to explore different timbres of sound. So Wavetable comes with hundreds of wavetables in a bunch of different categories. So if you're like me and you have nothing better to do in an afternoon, you can just check every single one of them and see how they sound until you find the one that you like the best. But typically it's more efficient to have an idea of what you want first. And one sound that I personally like is like a pad that has a choral kind of sound to it. And sounds that have that characteristic, like the vocal characteristic, are in the formant category. So I looked through that and I found a wavetable that I kind of liked, and used the filters and adjusted them a bit to emphasize some of the formant frequencies associated with that sound. And I get something that's kind of like this. So I feel like I'm in a fucking Enya album now, but I love this shit, not gonna lie. Just to reiterate, this is pretty much the same settings as the basic preset that I made, but with different wavetables and with the filters set a little bit differently. And that's basically all there is to it. There's no effects on this at all, and it could definitely get a lot more interesting if you throw a lot of reverbs or delays or saturations or chorus on it. So the last sound I wanted to show was something slower, where the sound morphs and grows as it's sustained, and it's more for these longer sustained chords. And the idea is basically the same as what I've been showing, but just with more extensive modulation, essentially. So I've chosen some wavetables where the timbre of the sound like morphs in a way that I think is interesting as the wavetable position moves. And I've got the modulation sources all like targeting the wavetable position in addition to everything else that I showed in the previous sounds. And also I've got the modulation sources modulating the Oscillator 1 and Oscillator 2 pan. So the sound not only kind of evolves as a sustained, but it also like pans around its space in a way that I think is cool. I think this type of sound also is a little bit more dependent on effects too. So I added some more effects in the chain here that I'll just go through quickly. A nice trick that I like to allow the sound to just morph and add more motion to it is to add a notch filter and just have the notch filter kind of move around in the frequency space slowly. So it kind of adds an interesting amount of motion to the sound, in my opinion. And I've also added some grain delay and just some regular echo delay too, which is a really great delay effect that comes with Ableton. So all that together, we get a sound that kind of sounds like this. I've got some reverb on it too. So that's the evolving pad sound designed entirely with Wavetable and stock effect plugins. So I think that's about it for today. I did want to briefly touch upon a few features that I didn't really demonstrate in the sounds that I was using, but I think nonetheless are pretty good features of Wavetable. First is the oscillator effects. So one thing that Wavetable does not allow you to do is cross modulation between Oscillator 1 and Oscillator 2, but you kind of get around that by the oscillator effects, which offer you this one, which is the pulse width modulation. I could simulate the oscillator sync. It also has, so those are the classic modes. FM simulates frequency modulation, so kind of like oscillator self-feedback. And modern does wave folding. So I think those are pretty good options, and of course you can use any of your modulation sources to modulate any of those parameters. The next thing is noise. So Wavetable does not have a dedicated noise source, and sometimes that's useful for pads. You can kind of generate noise using one of the noise wavetables, but you have to be a bit careful about that because by default it will generate something that sounds more like a harsh tone. But you can kind of get around that just by going to your FM oscillator effect and just cranking that up to 100%. And you get something that kind of sounds like noise if you really want to have, use one of your oscillators as noise. Now, personally, I think you're probably better off just putting Wavetable in a rack with something else like analog or drift or whatever, or operator, I guess, and just using the other instrument as your noise source. But you do you, I guess. The last thing is, or the next thing is the MIDI modulation matrix, which I didn't really touch upon, but you can modulate your MIDI no parameters, which are the velocity, key, pitch bend, pressure, aftertouch, and your mod wheel, and randomization to any one of your modulation targets, just like in your regular mod matrix. I think it's good to have some key modulation for your filters in a pad sound. I kind of forgot to show that in the pad setting that I was using, but that's usually something that I have to some extent in pad sounds. The randomization function kind of establishes adds some randomization to each of your parameters whenever you hit a MIDI note, which you might find to be useful. And I think it's probably more useful for like plucked sequences and things like that, but you might find that to be helpful in pads as well. So that's all I got for today. If you like this type of sound design content, just let me know in the comments and I'll try to make more videos like this. See you next time.